All right, so these are your Unit 1 notes on living organization and homeostasis. And kind of just a review of some basic biology concepts that we're going to be applying throughout the semester in anatomy. So we should remember from biology that all living things are made of cells and that the cell is the basic unit of life. Now, even though we know that the cell is the basic unit of life, and we talk about that a lot, and when we think about living systems, especially us humans as complex organisms, it's hard for us to sometimes remember that we are made of these non-living structures called atoms and molecules. And so the smallest level of organization in any living thing, no matter how complex or simple it is always atoms and molecules. The same types of atoms and molecules you remember learning about in chemistry are the same ones that make up your existence. Those atoms and molecules then can form larger structures like organelles in your cells, even larger structures like tissues, which are simply different types of cells working together on a common function. And tissues can form a larger structure called an organ, which are simply the tissues working together on a common function. And the organs can form larger systems called organ systems, where all the organs work together. And all of that together, all the organ systems working together with their organs, their tissues, their unique types of cells, organelles, and biomolecules, all are going to form you, the whole organism, the living thing. So we can see that here in this diagram. You very clearly can see up here that on the most basic level, again, we are made of atoms and molecules, and you might remember talking about certain types of molecules, biomolecules in biology. Those were things like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And those biomolecules are used to then form structures inside our cells called organelles, which help our unique cells perform functions. And then as the complex organisms we are, all those different types of cells that we're made of can work together to form tissues, which can form organs, organ systems, and eventually the whole living thing. And here's our little friend the rat, who we will be, fortunately or unfortunately, chopping into very soon. So getting back to what I tried to emphasize on that first slide, again, even though we think of us as this kind of super unique living system, we are made of, on the most simple level, non-living structures, atoms and molecules. The 6 biological elements that living systems are made of include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So those 6 elements then make up the basis of everything. When you touch your skin, your hair, when we talk about processes inside your heart or your stomach or intestine, we have to remember that all the way down on that smallest level, those are all made then of those biological elements. Those elements then are used to form the 4 types of biomolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And all of these molecules are used to form our cells, which are driven then by this constant exchange of energy throughout our cells and body, this constant exchange and reacting of different types of molecules, the movement of charged particles, the breaking of bonds, the release of energy, the formation of new bonds, the storing of energy. That constant cycling of energy in atoms or matter is really what's driving all these processes that we always simply refer to as health, or stuff that just keeps us healthy and living. So you don't need to know this yet, and you don't need to copy this down, but this is a diagram of a nervous system message. Right? You would normally just say in common terms that your brain sends quote unquote messages to different body parts or organs to make them do things. But this is what it is. A nervous system message, or a message from your brain, is actually this very intricate domino effect of the movement of sodium and potassium in and out the length here of a nerve cell. And when that finally stimulates a reaction from an organ, that was that message you're talking about. But we always want to remember, when we simplify things for our living existence, that what's driving those processes we are simplifying is really just chemical reactions that you studied way back in chemistry. Now, all of these different elements interact together, and they form all these different structures like your cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and you. And once they do that, they have to make sure that you, the living organism, and all the living cells you're made of, stay healthy and living. And so the process established in us that does that is homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining internal balance and stability. It's a system of involuntary processes and reactions that are in place with us in order to maintain balance in all of our living cells. So these mechanisms, or kind of pre-programmed reactions in our body, are what keep us living and healthy. And there are two types of mechanisms our bodies use to keep us living and healthy. One type is called a positive feedback mechanism, and the other type of homeostasis is negative feedback mechanisms. So we're going to start by talking about positive feedback mechanisms. Now I'm going to give a little disclaimer. The majority of homeostatic responses in our body are not based on or involving positive feedback mechanisms. They are just simply less common, and we see them more often in processes, especially with reproduction. But a positive feedback mechanism is one in which a process or product is increased in order to achieve a specific homeostatic result. So the way you can maybe try to remember this, if you think if you're working on a project or you gave a performance and you are going to receive feedback, right? We always look forward to positive feedback, getting compliments, people telling us what we did right, what was well, what looked good. You want more and more and more positive feedback. So a positive feedback mechanism then is a mechanism that makes more and more and more of something happen, because more of that is actually good for our bodies and our health. So my first example of a positive feedback mechanism is ovulation in a female. So ovulation refers to the release of an egg from female's ovary right before she'd be ready to conceive each month during her cycle. In order to stimulate ovulation, estrogen is released from her ovaries, and the estrogen stimulates her hypothalamus in her brain to secrete more hormones. Those other hormones stimulate the ovaries again to release more estrogen. And you have this constant cycle then repeating itself until the egg is released and the female then is able to become pregnant. So you have estrogen released from the ovaries, stimulating the hypothalamus gland, secreting more hormones, which stimulates the ovaries, which stimulates the release of estrogen, hypothalamus, more hormones, over and over again. So that's why it's positive feedback, because you get this series of steps that happen over and over again until a certain desirable end result is achieved, and that's a healthy end result we're aiming for. In my second example, we have childbirth, and it's very similar in description. So as a mother is pregnant, when the baby finally is large enough and descends in the uterus, it will eventually press against the mother's cervix. Well, this pressure triggers a nervous system response and a message to the brain that stimulates the pituitary gland to release a chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin then stimulates the uterus to contract more and more forcefully or aggressively. Well, those contractions then cause the baby to push further against the cervix, which sends more messages to the brain, more messages to the pituitary gland to release more oxytocin, but then that oxytocin stimulates more and stronger contractions. So eventually, right, we've heard of this before in childbirth, what builds up then is stronger and stronger and more frequent and close together contractions, eventually to the point where after this cycle repeats over and over again, the contractions are strong enough and frequent enough to push the baby out, right? It achieves an end result that is good for the living organism. Again, here's the diagram just showing that example of positive feedback referring to ovulation in a female. Right, you have the release of estrogen from the ovary here, which is going to stimulate the hypothalamus and the brain, which releases more hormones, which further stimulates the ovary, which further releases more estrogen, stimulating the hypothalamus. And you get this over and over again cycle until eventually an egg is released into the uterus at the very end of that female cycle, and she can then conceive from the process of ovulation. This diagram is showing the process of positive feedback with regard to childbirth. You can see here is the child in the womb. The head here is pressing against the cervix. Here would be the vaginal canal, which it would exit out of. So you have the baby's head lightly pressed initially against the cervix. That's going to send a message to the brain, which is going to stimulate the release of oxytocin, which is then going to stimulate stronger contractions. And a contraction in the uterus is literally it just squeezing like this. More squeezing like this, though, causes the baby to push further against the cervix. Again, more messages, more oxytocin, more contractions, until eventually the squeezing is strong enough to send this baby on out. But of course, we know it's not that easy. Our last type of homeostatic mechanism is going to be a negative feedback mechanism. And this is just the exact opposite of positive feedback. Let's first think back to what these words mean and think about it in common terms. So if we think back when I said, if you just did a performance or a project and you're going to receive feedback, you want more and more positive feedback. And even though negative feedback probably is useful and you need it to improve something, you don't want a lot of it, right? You want it to stop. Well, that's basically what a negative feedback mechanism does. It's a process that's in place to stop something that's happening in order to redirect the body and go in its normal path toward its normal settings or homeostatic balance. My first example is shivering. We have all shivered when we're cold or we get the chills out of nowhere. Your initial stimulus is your body temperature dropping. You've walked into a room that's super cold, a draft blew through a window, you got the chills. The message is sent to your brain then that your body temperature has dropped, and that stimulates your muscles to contract. So in this instance, when your body temperature drops, we don't want it to drop further, and we don't want it to stay low. So in negative feedback, we're going to stop that change. We want to stop your body temperature from dropping and being low. And a process or chemical reaction is going to be in place to make it go back up to its normal temperature. So with shivering, when your muscles contract, causing you to shiver, those muscle contractions from your shivering actually produce more body heat to counteract the drop in body temperature and slowly warm you back up. My second example of a negative feedback mechanism is red blood cell production. We use red blood cells in our bodies to carry oxygen-based gases where they need to go. So let's say there's a drop in blood oxygen, right? The amount of oxygen you're supposed to have flowing in your blood attached to your blood cells has all of a sudden dropped. Your brain has recognized this. Again, in negative feedback, we want to stop it from being like this. So your brain notices there's too low of oxygen. We want to stop it from dropping further, stop it from being too low. So there's processes in place to bring your blood oxygen back to a normal state. So in this instance then, your kidneys are stimulated to produce a hormone that causes your bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. And the idea here in your body is that more red blood cells can hopefully increase the carrying of oxygen gases throughout the body, bringing your body back up to an oxygen homeostasis. So we can see here in a diagram an example of temperature. What we have down here, right, we have a little seesaw. It's a good example of what homeostasis is, right? Ideally, we should always be balanced, but whenever our little homeostasis seesaw tips one way or another, either too low, too high, with whatever we might be talking about, then there's a process in place to stop it from dipping too low or high and bring it back to its normal level state. So here with temperature, again, your body temperature drops, message is sent to the brain, you shiver. The shivering is going to stop the imbalance here, and it's going to cause you to produce more body heat, increase your body temperature, bringing you back to balance. And the same goes for sweating, actually. So when you get too warm, then you're imbalanced too high, right? Your body temperature is too high, message is sent to your brain, your body then is going to stop it from being too high, and it's then going to cause you to sweat. And that evaporation of your sweat is actually what cools you off, and in turn brings your body temperature back down to its normal state. And again, same thing with blood oxygen, and we see it here with our red blood cell production. You see that seesaw again in the center. Again, with negative feedback, something changes. It goes too low, too high. Your body is going to stop it from being like that because that change is bad, and a process is in place to bring it back up to a normal state. So here with red blood cell production, blood oxygen drops too low. Kidneys are going to release a hormone that stimulates your bone marrow to make more red blood cells to bring either the red blood cell count or oxygen level back up to this normal level state.